Hi everyone, this is Lauren Williams, President-elect of the Houston chapter of IABC. Here's a peek into one of our members-only events with chapter partner Chris Mykrantz.
Just a little bit of quick background on myself. I've been a proponent of manager communications forever. I've trained several hundred managers in communication skills going back as far as 1995 with Greenpoint Financial up in New York. And, this has been one of those kind of off and on subjects with the communication function is, how much or how little do we use our management team as a communication tool? And if we're going to do that, how do we make them as effective as possible and give them a chance to really add value to our communications as an organization? So training is obviously a big part of that. And I mentioned that in the blog post because I think, if you all have experienced, managers during your career and their propensity to either do a good job with communicating or not, then that training can obviously help those folks in a sense. I used to have I worked for Conrail for 10 years and we had a senior vice president who I'll just say his first name was Don, who they used to call Neutron Don because when he showed up, all the people left, but the buildings were left standing. But anyway, one of his comments to me once when we were talking about this subject was, well, what do our people need to know? All they have to do is run trains. And that kind of belied his ignorance of the benefit of being able to effectively use a management team to communicate. One of the things that this pandemic has kind of heightened is obviously the awkwardness that a lot of managers are going to feel in terms of trying to communicate with their employees because they may have a unit that's now 100% remote for them. They may have a unit that's mixed and they have some folks right in front of them or easy access and others who are working from home. And so it really makes their job harder in terms of figuring out how do I connect and engage with people that I have and still maintain the ability to communicate effectively with those people when I need to, even though I may have to use two different entirely sets of skills to be able to do that with an audience that I've got in front of me and an audience that's going to be remote. I think the other thing, and I pointed that out in the blog also, is that the issue of how does a communicator actually support that management channel is one of the other things that the discussion has kind of evolved back and forth over time. And a lot of it has devolved into, well, let's just create a set of talking points in a kit and we'll send it all out and they'll do fine. Which again, number one, kind of belies the notion that managers will actually know what to do with this material when we send it to them. And second, it kind of leaves out the issue of context, which I mentioned, which is important for employees. Big corporate messages don't necessarily resonate with a group of people who are in a specific business unit and want to know, okay, well, how does this affect us? And if a manager is not prepared to be able to add that context to the conversation, then it still leaves those open questions for folks. And so those are some of the big issues that I think have just gotten amplified in terms of the pandemic and the response of managers to it and being able to effectively use them as a communication channel. I think in large part because, and I'm open to hearing experiences from a lot of different folks in terms of how they've handled things over the past year. But my sense is twofold. One, it's been firefighting most of the time for the past 12 months. And two, that's been characterized by let's just get as much information out to as many people as possible as fast as we can. And so there's some introspection, I think, due on the part of a lot of communication functions to see, okay, how have we done over the past year? Which channels are working and which aren't? And are we using or not using our managers effectively to be able to support all of that communication that's going out? So that's kind of the gist of the argument in the blog. But I'm interested to hear kind of, to start with, how has all of this impacted, communication strategies? Using managers more or less these days? Have they been effective? All of those kinds of things that are going to ultimately play into this.
I think this is kind of interesting on a few fronts. So there were two things in your blog that kind of stuck out to me. One was when you were talking about training as a must, you said communication is an unnatural act for most people. 100% agree with that. And then you were discussing context and saying it's not enough for managers to just rehash the corporate messages they're handed. And I think that's been a problem. I just started a new role that was that's agency life, and it's completely different than what I did before on the corporate side of things. And one of the comments that I made early on to someone about my new role was it's totally different in that when the C-suite executives tell you something, they follow through with it. And at the other company that I was at, it was almost like they were sometimes just checking the box and saying, okay, here are talking points that we can give you, and if your employees ask, maybe direct them to these resources. And I feel like that's been one of the challenges for working from home during this like COVID environment is I don't know that all managers and leaders are actually leading. It frustrated me, I think, last year when you heard about stepping up, being authentic, and then you had leaders like refuse to pick up the phone and call people just to check in to see how they're doing. And I don't know, to me, I felt like it exposed more gaps than anything else. And maybe that was just the situation that I was in, but I'm kind of curious your thoughts on maybe that analysis.
And that's what crisis will do. I mean, it will, if you've got gaps in your organization, communication, leadership, management, whatever the gaps are, it will expose them really quickly. And I think that's one of the things that's happened over the last 12 months with a lot of organizations is that there were problems that might have been, minor, it's an annoyance, thorn in the side kind of thing. But the imposition of this crisis mode for the past 12 months has made them really glaring. And because of this whole flood of employees who are now remote workers instead of being, in a position where they could be face to face with a manager, it's made things even worse because you get that much more barrier in between you and your manager to be able to say, okay, how can we address this? And a lot of those problems are going to show up in communication.
Mm-hmm. To that point, you have to be so much more intentional about your communication while remote. And in this past year, my supervisor and I, whereas before we would just strike up conversations, we would see each other, I would, stick my head in her office, we would have a chit chat. Now we have scheduled monthly check-ins and things like that, not because anything was wrong, but because we don't have those organic conversations anymore. You have to be more purposeful and intentional about literally scheduling those chats, even if they're still informal once they're actually happening, but getting them on the books and getting the coordination and how you're going to talk to each other on the phone, is it Zoom, whatever, it's just become more complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then multiply that times, a mid-level manager who may have, dozens of folks in their unit and is managing a product, managing a revenue stream, managing an operational, a significant operational piece of the organization, and may have people all over the place at this point. And that was kind of my point in terms of having a plan and sticking to it. Again, this is an area where I think the communicators can really support managers by giving them, planning templates, giving them the materials to be able to fill that out. Obviously, the corporate messages kind of drop in at the top. But then how do you help them develop that context to say, okay, here's what the C-suite said, and here's what this is going to mean for us today, next week, whatever it might be. Huge value added for managers to be able to do that.
How do you work in agility and those plans? Because I think that's one of the, it's just, what is it, that Mike Tyson quote that, you can have the best game plan, but until you get punched in the face, it changes everything. How do you factor in agility and being able to adapt to environments and your team's like actual needs?
Yep, I think there's a couple of things. One is just working in constant updates. So if it's weekly, if it's bi-weekly, whatever it is, that material's got to stay fresh with your management team. The second thing is, and I mentioned this in the blog post as well, is there isn't going to be a whole lot of demand right now, given the way things are, to pull managers, out of the day-to-day flow of operations and sit them down and say, okay, we're going to do 2 days of communication training. But if you can be nimble enough to be able to throw out an hour here and an hour there for those folks, to be able to say, here, we're going to focus on just one point and one point only, give you a little bit of skill that you can use, send you away, bring you back in a couple of weeks for another hour. Breaking that down, I think, gives you an opportunity to be a lot more agile as an organization, and move more quickly. And I think the management team will certainly benefit from the skill building that I know a lot of organizations have talked about doing, but just haven't gotten around to.
How has it changed, like, for you? Because I know in 2020 you started your own business, and I remember, gosh, the last IABC Houston event that we had was, like, I think a happy hour in February, and I think that's when you told me that you were starting your own business. And I mean, that's got to be an incredibly difficult thing to do, especially, first off, incredibly difficult to start a business, period, regardless of what the environment is, and then to do it when there's a global pandemic. I mean, how did you kind of adapt your style, to stay relevant?
Well, I think one of the things I've had to do is be aggressive about all of the connection opportunities that I've had. And I think obviously the involvement with the IABC chapter here in Houston has been a part of that. Exposure is the biggest thing. How do you get it? How do you maintain it? How do you, in a sense, starting a business like this is in a large part about thought leadership. And, obviously being able to put expertise out there for people to take a look at is one of the ways of doing that. So I focused a lot on that. And obviously then also, working the contacts that I have, which fortunately over a career that's longer than I'd like to admit, I've got quite a few of them. So being able to generate connections that lead to connections through a network like that is the other test of being able to even during difficult times, being able to get something up and running.
What I encountered that some of the leaders, like there's two types of leaders that I'm working with. Some of them are very eager to do changes that the communication professionals proposing, but some of them, it's hard for them to change their mindset first with some of them, right? Especially like product owners maybe. But also the other thing, because, some of the people being let go, they had so much work that even though they're eager to do that, it's hard for them to, juggle around in addition to their direct responsibilities. It's hard for them to okay, by the time they got to the communication point, they already don't remember what I said to them. So I think the change mindset, like how would you change the mindset of those people who doesn't want to communicate, doesn't want to even try to do that.
Yeah.
And so how to keep the focus for those managers who want to do something, how to advise them to where they can find the time to do so.
So I'm taking from your comments that one of the things that you're dealing with is a manager or managers who say, I've already got all of this stuff on my plate and now you want me to communicate too. Is that accurate?
Yes, it's accurate. Yes.
Okay. So one of the things that I've always told managers, and it usually works pretty well when you when you kind of get nose to nose with them and it actually help them understand it, is that one of a manager's big responsibilities is problem solving. And a lot of times it's problem solving that comes up because something went wrong. Somebody did something they weren't supposed to, or didn't do something they were supposed to do, or didn't do it the right way, or whatever that is. Those are communication issues at the root. And the ability of a manager to communicate effectively with the folks who work for them is part and parcel with being able to prevent some of those issues at time. If you can take some of that away by communicating more effectively, you create time for yourself. So communication is actually a tool that can be used to make things more efficient. And not cause the kinds of problems that typically come up from disconnects and lack of communication. So that's one point. I think the second point is to be able to put together an approach that shows a manager, here's how I'm going to help you. I'm going to give you this tool, and they're really easy to use, and I'm going to show you how to use them, and I'm going to give you a chance to practice them, and by the time you really have to use them, you'll be really good at it. And I think that's the other thing that a lot of managers are looking for. Again, I think we've gotten to this tendency to say, we'll just put together some messages and talking points and everything, and we'll email it to all of our managers, and they'll do great with it. I would wager that 1 out of 2 managers get those packages and say, I have no idea what to do with this. And so I think that's the other thing that really communicators can focus on is, how do I make this easier? And not make it appear like such a burden. Those are 2 things I think that typically work really well. You can shrink that down to microcosm with a manager or 2 or 3 or 4. Ask them to tell you about an issue that they think came up because of a communication breakdown. And maybe talk to them about how you could have avoided that issue in the past. And what did it cost us? Time-wise, people-wise, money-wise. If you can avoid that, there's an ROI to all of that. So there's a lot of things there that you can say to managers to say, here's where this benefits the organization. It's not something I'm just throwing on top of the pile that we're going to expect you to do in, the time that you don't have.
How do you recover when maybe you do have those like shortcomings? Whether you're a manager or you see them on your team, like how do you bounce back? Especially, I don't know, because you can't have those conversations that Lauren alluded to earlier, stepping into a line manager's office. Like how do you correct that behavior? How do you ensure that it doesn't happen again? How do you improve upon it?
That's tough. Way back in my career at Allied Signal, I used to have as one of my internal clients an HR manager who would call me at least once every 2 weeks and say, gee, Chris, we had a little screw up in communication. I need you to come fix it. And after 3 or 4 of those, I said to her, why don't you call me before you do the communication so I can help you get it right and we won't have the screw ups. I think that's, it's a difference between constantly doing damage control and then being able to get people ingrained in using you as a resource ahead of time, not just for the person to come in and kind of try to clean up the mess that they've made, which depending upon what the situation is, could be no problem at all, or could be hugely difficult. It just depends on what it is that got screwed up. Again, I think it's really instructive for managers to show them the tangible impact of communicating well versus not communicating well in terms of, people time lost, in terms of rework, in terms of quality issues, in terms of, ROI to the organization, any of those kinds of things that you can quantify becomes a huge benefit. I'll give you a quick example. When I worked for Conrail, we had a 1 year where we had a huge spike in injuries on the job. And injuries are one of those things where you can pretty quickly point to an ROI for the organization in terms of lost people time, lawsuits filed by the employee who got hurt, all of those kinds of things. And we took some of those incidents and we piled them up and we measured somewhere in the neighborhood of a 2,000 or a little bit more % return to the organization by doing it right. And so basically what we did was took a 3x5 card with the month's talking points around safety, stuck it in the shirt pocket of 35 executives, told them to put on jeans and work boots, and sent them out on the property once a month. And they were supposed to engage as many employees as possible during that time and talk about nothing but safety. And within a month, the accident rate tipped over and started to decline. and we could actually quantify that ROI that we've measured. So those are the kinds of things, if you can create those little lab experiments out of situations that have kind of gone awry, it's really difficult for somebody to look at you and say, well, communication didn't have anything, to do with saving us, $5 million in injury costs. So just a little example there of the kind of impact that you can have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so much to be said for doing it right the first time. Like to Dasha's example, communicating correctly before issues arise, before injuries happen, before you try to deliver the message poorly, and then you have to deal with damage control as a result of attempting to do well and then not. And it seems so common sense when we just talk about it abstractly in a conversation like this. But I think it's when it comes down to those real life situations that it becomes much harder for people to see because they're just so close to the situation.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think everybody gets caught up in the rush of, I've got to get X, Y, and Z done today, or else there's going to be hell to pay. And communication doesn't kind of, pierce that frame of reference. You don't think about, okay, what am I communicating here when you're trying to scramble and get things done. and that's when the slip ups happen, and make an already tight situation, potentially worse. So again, it's back to Dasha and your comment about mindsets. I think there is a lot to be said about being able to get a few key members of your senior leadership organization on board with the notion that communication is not an extra, it's not a nice to have. It's got to be part and parcel of doing business on a daily basis, or else we're going to have serious problems with the organization. Fortunately, at some of the businesses I've worked for on the corporate side, I was able to do that. In particular with a couple of CEOs who got it, understood what the opportunities were and what the downside was if we didn't.
Wanted to raise the issue of generational differences and how that's played into the transition to remote working with the pandemic, the very quick influx of technology needed, and digital skills needed to be communicating and continuing with our jobs, especially how that's impacted manager and direct report relationships.
I think it makes those manager and direct report relationships more critical. And I think they're going to become more critical with the greater percentage of the workforce that actually are millennials. One of the characteristics of that millennial audience is that they tend to be much harder to develop loyalty and attract long-term to an organization. That's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just how they happen to be. And I think it's incumbent upon organizations, and Austin, this kind of goes back to your comment about benefits. It goes beyond that, obviously, but I think that organizations are going to have to take those relationships and also some of the tangible things that they put on the table to attract and retain people into consideration, and view them through that lens of, I'm a millennial and here are the things that I'm going to demand in an organization that I'm going to show loyalty to if they're going to get that loyalty from me. So understanding all of those things, and I think the manager relationship is key. I think that managers have a hard time, at least in the past, and the ones who are probably from older generations will have a more difficult time developing those relationships and kind of getting the balance right, to be able to make sure that you're developing that loyalty among employees who may work for you. Communication is going to be a big part of it, and not just the kind of communication we've been talking about, but also getting really down to one-on-one interpersonal. Being able to develop people, talk to them one-on-one about what their goals are, what is it they think they need to get there. Managers will really have to be good at developing the folks who work for them, and being able to send them off to bigger and better things within the organization as quickly as they think those people can progress. And it's going to be something that I think is going to be very important for organizations to get good at really quickly, again, as that percentage of millennials starts to ramp up in terms of their presence vis-a-vis the rest of the workforce.